Sure.
I can see the danger in both sides. I think the danger on the one hand is that we totally close down inquiry. On the other hand, the danger is dogmatism. On the other hand, is sort of this tangential, not getting anywhere sort of idea.
But inquiry must pursue questions. Inquiry must pursue questions. That's the nature of inquiry.
Would you agree that at some point in inquiry there is that sort of wandering, that exploratory, that doesn't have an end focus yet?
Maybe, but I don't think by throwing in a random thought that has popped into your head. It has to ultimately or in some way bear upon the question. So that's why the question is not get on the question, you're off the question. It's rather, how do you see that as bearing on the question? That enables the person to make a new connection. To say something surprising, to me it doesn't seem to bear on the question, but I don't say to the student, that doesn't bear on the question. I say, how do you see that bearing on the question? And sometimes they say, well, in this way, and then they explain it, and I say, interesting, yes, I hadn't thought about it that way, and I wouldn't have noticed that feature, but thank you for bringing it in, because that gives us a new connection into relevance. Let's move from relevance to depth. Depth focuses on complexity. Were we, and to what extent were we addressing the complexity of the question? What moves that were being made were relevant to recognizing and dealing with complexity? Maria.
When you ask for a conservative approach or a liberal approach, when you select an idea from somebody and then interconnect with another one.
Okay, let's take the first one. The first one, bringing in conservative and liberal, I would put more under breadth than depth, although there's a sense in which by bringing in breadth, you also deal with the complexity that is connected with multiple points of view. So I think you're right to connect that with depth, although I think its fundamental home is best described in breadth. Now, showing connections between answers, I think that is complexity. So then we can see that this is actually connected with that. Very often we get chicken and egg relationships that produce complexity. Do you see, take the point that was made earlier on of teachers teaching as they were taught, their teachers taught as they were taught, and a malpractice gets passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation. That's a complex problem because it's a chicken and egg situation. There doesn't seem to be any nice point to intervene. You could say, well, what about the teachers of teachers? Well, they are teaching as they were taught. And they were taught by the same teachers. So that you get into a complexity, and I thought that was brought out by Carolyn, the complexity of teaching as we're taught. Yes?
Yeah, but we really didn't deal with anything in depth. We were brainstorming and getting several ideas. As a teacher, we might follow up with an exercise on one little part of what we came out with.
Yes, indeed. So we were pointing to dimensions of depth and complexity, but we didn't fully deal with any of them. So we were getting them on the floor, but they weren't. Now, you can follow up a Socratic discussion with an assignment or with group discussion. I'd like you to break into groups of threes. Each group will focus on one of the complexities. Pick any one you want. They're listed up on the board. Pick one and be prepared to say something to the class as a whole, which will help us better understand how to deal with that complexity. And that can be a follow-up activity. Yes?
When it came to depth, I thought the way that you dealt with it was a lot like breadth. It was more holistic. In other words, you really weren't subjecting each of us to the standards requiring us to go in great depth, but you were piecing us together as a group. So the discussion was reaching depth and it was reaching breadth at the same time. And you guided that by piecing people's answers together.
Now that is a very interesting observation to me and resonates very well with at least part of my strategy in the classroom. In a traditional classroom, on a traditional way of looking at things, you give one-on-one feedback. You write on particular students' pages, you correct them. You grade, which means to correct, and you put down corrections, you know, and so forth. I don't believe that's the best way to learn. I think the best way to learn is to see your errors and mistakes as a group rather than personalized. So if you notice a problem and you point it out as a problem in the group, no one takes it personally because it isn't them, and somehow it's diffuse in the group. We have a problem with clarity. We need to elaborate further. We need to give better examples. But we don't say, you, Paul, you have that problem. You must change. And so I believe it's a better strategy to try to bring it out in a global sense than to personalize it. Yes?
I have a couple of concerns about probably breadth and depth together. When we role play a position which we don't hold and maybe are not well informed in, what we say can be essentially caricatures.
Yes, indeed.
And give the appearance of breadth where there is none, or maybe even make us more comfortable with our
now
existing
that we've considered your foolish conservative point of view and have demonstrated our open-mindedness, we can now come to our liberal conclusion. Yes, the definite danger.
To continue related to going back to accuracy, suppose that a number of the contributions represent fundamental misperceptions about your discipline, and there's no one in the group who's likely to be able to bring that out through continued discussion. What do you do at that point?
You play devil's advocate. You say, I can imagine a person who would say this. Now, you're not participating in the discussion because you are not taking ownership of the voice. You're saying, here's a thought. I'm going to play devil's advocate. I'm going to throw in an idea I heard. You know, here's the idea. What's your reaction to it? So that's what you can do. And so there's always in Socratic questioning a move that you can make. Or you could have that present in some materials and say, let's bring into the discussion a voice, which I have here in this book. I'm going to read off this voice. Let's see what you think about this way of looking at things. So you can sort of plan that in advance or bring it in as devil's advocate.